No. I was just desperate. It was 1:30. I was hungry, and we were on our
Uh-huh.
way back from Maine. And we had another whatever, I don't know, 6 hours of drive ahead of us. So I took what I could.
Yeah, that's Roland, the raccoon of driving eaters. He'll eat anything as long as it's a good story later.
The interstate raccoon. Oh boy, that nickname will follow me now forever. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roland. It's funny. It's the fall, which means things are getting a little bit cooler outside, and I can finally actually go maybe for a jog. I'm usually very hot-blooded, so when I try and do physical exercise outside, it gets really warm. But now that it's kind of cooling off, I've been able to jog a little more, and I'm really enjoying that. How you doing, Roland?
I thought you were talking about how cool this podcast was and that we just got rated the number one EA podcast at FeedSpot. But okay.
Hey, congratulations to us.
Yeah, shameless pitch, humble bragging. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Nothing to complain about. I think that's the best you can get out of a German, So I'm looking forward to our great conversation. And I'm happy to announce that we, for whatever reason, we were able to capture or gather or acquire another guest for this show here. I don't know what those guys are all doing. So I'd like to welcome Mike DeCamp to our show today. And Mike will talk about business architecture for a new product, right? And Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you. But before we get started with you talking about new product and business architecture, our audience likes to get to know our guests. So tell us a little bit more about yourself. So your name, who you are, what you do right now, and sort of how you got there.
Absolutely. Well, Mike DeCamp. I am a certified business architect with the Business Architecture Guild. It's been around for a couple of years, not super long. My background, I've basically been a business analyst, project manager, change agent, all those sorts of adjectives, all under the guise and real passion for business process management and improvement. Very big, advocate for the Lean and Six Sigma types of approaches. You can't improve what you don't measure kind of thought process. Right now, I'm in the product management space. I work for a healthcare institution. I still dive in, try to where I can with business process improvement. So try to leverage process mining to get that baseline, to try to see those variances. Really try to understand where the bottlenecks reside, and take a data-driven approach, right? Because as you guys have said many times, and everybody in this space sort of knows it, it's, you document the process, you're really only getting one or two perspectives out of the 2 or 3 dozen that exist, all those variations. And then you also have to try and take into account how people might be feeling that day. Oh, at one point in time, it's a 7-minute activity, and another day it's a 72-minute activity, depending on what happened in that given situation. So I really think that automated process discovery via process mining and task mining is something I'm very interested in. And then try to take opportunities to help, improve that process. And I see that happening in one of many ways, like process automation via RPA. If it's data exchange, we want to try and leverage some sort of web services and APIs, what have you, interfaces. But another one that's really important is just standardization, right? Like standardizing that process because you have all those variances.
Yeah. I got to tell you, I had a webinar recently where we asked people what your biggest challenges in process and architecture. And I was actually quite surprised when we got the results back. The poll was very heavily weighted in process standardization. And I asked lots of different types of questions, like, executive alignment and buy-in, or like process optimization, leaning, those sorts of things. I asked things like, process knowledge repository. No, it was process standardization was the number one. And it kind of surprised me. I feel like I was taken aback on the call, and I was like, okay, everyone, I guess your poll results tell me what you're looking to do. And man, that is a huge concern people have.
But speaking of standardization, we also follow a little standard process here in these shows. And one of the things, Mike, that we're obviously asking our guests about is more the personal side, so that our audience can learn a little bit more about you. So would you mind talking a little bit about you as a person, your hobbies, your interests, your bucket list items, and all that stuff before we deep dive into the actual content?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for allowing me to introduce myself. I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller to the podcast here. When I don't know, I think it's been like 2 years or something, maybe longer, but I've was trying to get into the enterprise architecture space. I'm very interested in it. But although I grew up with technology around me, I'm a Zennial, or aged millennial, whatever you want to call me. I actually enjoy the business side of things. So when I was getting into this, I found you guys. I thought you were touching on all the right pieces for me. So long time, first time. On a more personal note, I am a dad. I've got 2 young boys. They are 7 and 10, trying to get into the sports space with them, keeping up with them, trying to raise some good humans. I'm an avid chess player. I like to play guitar. I do enjoy cooking a lot. My wife and I try to diversify our cooking regimen. Even during COVID, probably many people, as cliche as this is, I tried learning how to make bread. So I successfully learned how to do a little bit of that. I even went as far as to learn how to make pastries. So I was able to make some croissants, which was interesting. Kind of hard to do. You got to when you don't have a good industrial grade kitchen, the heat and temperature can really mess things up pretty quickly. So, but of course we're all at home doing nothing anyway. So.
Yeah, except you're like me and you're baking stone breads. Very exquisite. Wow. I can recommend that.
Also, I feel like the fail condition for a croissant is like a sweet roll. It's not quite croissant, but like, hey, listen, it's carbs. I'll eat it. I love it.
I made bagels and muffins. I was just like, I had a bakery in my kitchen. I was like, I love this stuff,
So, Mike, in all seriousness, you mentioned it a little bit that you found business and business architecture always interesting, but how did you get to this? Because that's typically an epiphany that more IT-focused people don't have, that they rather buckle up and go deeper into nerdism and come up with some super elaborate, elegant and whatever solutions, but the business side will be forgotten.
Absolutely. So I sort of mentioned it earlier. So I grew up in the technology age, more or less. Like I was in high school on the internet, and I went to school for telecommunications management, learning about computer networking. I never was really a programmer by heart, but I also built computers. Like I would put all the components together and what have you. But once I started getting more into the working professionally, I was more or less interested if you shift left from a problem and you start to understand a little bit more like, well, what's the reason why we want to solve this problem? Or what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And how does it relate back to things that are important to the organization? And I started drifting further away from the technology and more to the business and the more, quote, strategy stuff. So I became a program manager and everything. And at that level, at some points, I'm working with middle to sort of senior managers, and I'm seeing the decisions that they're making, but they're making them almost off the cuff or based on gut reactions or on limited information. And ultimately what was happening, and I think a lot of people might have this experience, is you're seeing a series of unintended consequences. You pull a lever here, you push a button there, you make a decision here, what have you, and then you let it ride. But you inevitably find out that maybe you are changing something in some other area of the business that you didn't anticipate. What is the implications of dropping the pebble in the water and seeing the ripple effect? I think that business architecture enables an organization to see it from the business side of things. It's technology agnostic. It almost doesn't care about technology. It just acknowledges that it exists, and that is a fundamental aspect of every modern organization. But it tries to distill it away from technology and just looks at it from like a couple core perspectives. You have your value stream perspective, which I'm a little on the fence about this terminology because it's an old term and it can be used in many different contexts. Sometimes I feel like words matter, and if we have the same word with different meanings, it creates lots of confusion. But in the right, but in the context of business architecture and what the business architecture guilds BizBach sort of describes, it's a value stream is really just a high level representation of how an organization delivers value to a customer or to a stakeholder, right? Customers could be one piece, stakeholders could be externally, they could be regulation, they could be other suppliers and partners, what have you. Then you have your capability. Again, another term, right? So the definition of the capability in this context, it's what a business does. And you can measure that capability in its maturity, right? Saying, is it automated, fully automated? Is it fully manual? Is it paper processing, pushing paper? Or do you have some robust technology applications to help facilitate automating this work? And then you have business information concepts or business objects, which essentially are the nouns of an organization, like the things that are important to an organization. And it could be your assets, it could be your partners, your customers, what have you. And you try to bring these things together by sort of reflecting on value streams, in my view, create context. Why are we doing what we're doing for whom? Capabilities provide us an insight into what we're doing and what we're capable of doing. And then those capabilities are based off of the information concepts or the business objects that are important to the organization. You could start to layer in stakeholders because they participate in your value streams. They influence it, or are affected by it, what have you. So that's really where I was coming from.
Yeah, I agree. But I also see, when you're talking about the terms, I also see some, inflation, if you will, because back in the day, look how old I am. It was not a value stream. It was a goddamn end-to-end process, so a different term for the actual, in my opinion, same thing. So having said that, how does business architecture in your mind relate to other disciplines or to other frameworks? When you talk to people, they say, oh yeah, I do process management, whatever process management is. Some others say, oh, I do business architecture. Some others says, oh, I'm modeling something in BPMN, or I follow a framework or a reference, whatever. How do you see the concept of business architecture with those three things that you just mentioned? How do you see them relate to each other? Or is it something completely separate, something that a listener to this show would say, oh, that's something new I haven't heard about. I need to definitely follow up on that.
So in the context of BPMN, the notation, the modeling language, or any other modeling languages, but BPMN being process specific, and that's sort of what I grew up on. So to your point, yes, value streams, in the context of business architecture, it's not an end-to-end where you might think of like procure to pay or order to cash or hire to retire, because those loop back to the organization. In this example, it would be, how do you get your customer? How do you market to them? How do you get them through the sales cycle? And then how do you land them in the end and they become a customer, right? Now that they're a paying customer, as an example.
So you're referring to the business model versus the operational model? Is that where you see the distinction?
Correct. That's a great point. Yes. So I think that from what I've learned and what my appreciation of the business architecture's guild perspective is that business architecture sort of sits in between your business model and your operating model, right? You have your business model sort of laying the vision and the reason why this organization exists and who the customers are that they're trying to go after. And then your operating model sort of defines your day-to-day operations and how things get done.
So how is that then different when I think about a framework like TOGAF, which has the idea of capturing everything and describing everything from a strategy and vision through business architecture, through applications data, blah, 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 all the stuff behind. Is it something separate? Is it included? Is it just new words to carve out a niche for the guild? Or what's your perspective on that?
It's a great point. So in fact, the OMG, they are helping to redefine what business architecture means in the context of TOGAF, right? I think TOGAF is universally understood as an enterprise architecture framework, and the ADM with all the letters in the circle, that's a fairly good representation of what an enterprise does, right? But for a very long time, the business architecture domain, letter B or C, whatever it was in the ADM, was not thoroughly thoughtful, defined. It really jumped right into the technology and the application and the data points of it, and then around the circle to execution. So the guild has, in effect, attempted to define that section, and then they're sorting it out through VOMG and back with TOGAF, so that lots of the disciplines and concepts and the way the approach is actually going to be more or less baked into what TOGAF business architecture section says. It's not just process. It's not just process.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I had the pleasure when I was working for that little accounting firm from around the corner. I had the pleasure to be the global firm's representative in the TOGAF forum for, I think, 5 or 6 years. So my impression was, it's a bunch of IT people, and business is everything that we do not understand. And therefore, as you rightfully said, that just jumped on ADM
Correct.
phases C and later.
Correct. And that's the thing. I mean, it's almost inherent, a technologist or even a person who has a certain craft, right? If you give them a problem, they're almost inevitably going to jump to the solution with the craft that they're masterful in, right?
Yeah.
You have a hammer, everything is a nail.
I just want to say the same thing. Yes, everything is a nail. Yes. Speaking of nails, now that's a very hard stretch because I'm aiming towards the artifacts that you create in business architecture. What type of nails do you actually see that a business architect creates, or in this case, uses to bang them with their hammer?
Right. So I think it's like a series or a collection of concept models where, you get your capability map, and it's really, that's one of them, right? You can say, we've got layer 1 capabilities, and these are business capabilities based on objects that are important to the business, defined by the business. You can take reference models, and then you curtail those reference models to reflect the importance and the naming conventions that a business chooses to use. But then you can decompose them into, say, the parent is partner management. And then you can say that there's partner information management. So you're managing information about your partners. You have agreements, partner agreement management, and so on and so forth. And you can further decompose these things, and you can match them up to other things, right? Because you could say you have an agreement management capability, and that agreement can actually be applied, that agreement management capability, that thing that you are able to do, can be applied equally to your partners and your customers. So now you can now then say, well, rather than having distinct things that essentially allow you to do the same thing with maybe a slightly different context, you can then say, we have an ability to establish agreements. We have the ability to do it with customers and with suppliers, or with regulators or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I would call them capability configurations, because if you put in that little term in between where you say, okay, this is used for a specific purpose, then you can extend this, right? Mm-hmm. When you, in the second part of this conversation, we're talking about products and how it relates to it. But when you plan, for example, the development of a product or the releases of a product, well, what do you actually do? You release different configurations of the final thing until you finally have it completely built out, Or again, an example from the little audit firm that I was working in, we had an internal project where we were looking at the internal audit offering, right? And what we figured out very quickly is that when you have 3,500 internal auditors in the US firm and 30 in the Dutch firm, that the requirements are quite different, right? And that the smaller firm might not want to have that big, fully automated tool that we were envisioning to implement, and it might be just overkill. So you could think about capability configurations as something like gold, silver, bronze, so you have different fidelities in there. So I wholeheartedly agree that this is important. The challenge that I see with that is it's still abstract. How do you get these concepts to, I like to say, a mere mortal, so that they understand it?
100%. Yeah. So I love living and playing in the abstract, but ultimately things have to come to be realized. So one thing that's a really neat deliverable or artifact that's producing as a result of this BizArc work is you have these cross maps. So you take this, what I really like is where you take the value stream, right? So you get your value stream, you have your context. Okay. Who are you working with? Your stakeholders. And it's kind of like a SIPOC diagram too, where you have your entrance criteria, your exit criteria. Then you also have your participating stakeholders, who's participating in this value stream. Then you can also have the item of value, right? Because your value stream has, say, 5 stages. And then within each stage, you have your entrance to exit and so on and so forth. But then there's also an increment of value, right? So those at an aggregate produce a thing for the person at the end of the value stream, the package of value.
Yeah. Can you give an example to make it tangible, what that progression would mean?
Working in healthcare, right? There's a value stream called the obtain a treatment value stream, right? And it's made up of 6 stages. First, you have your patient is presenting with a condition, right? Then you have capturing your patient's medical information, determining their diagnosis, presenting a treatment plan, getting acceptance from the patient to then perform the treatment plan, and then disseminating that plan out to the patient and to the other providers that are going to effectively do the work. Right.
And I like that you talk about this at a level of abstraction that doesn't specify the individual task required to achieve this goal. What you're doing is you're stipulating that this goal must be achieved. And I suspect there are probably regulatory obligations on that pathway, or at least some like best practices and guides on the pathway you must take. But then how you solve the problem of getting there is something that you can nuance rather than something that is, everything is stipulated and that's all you can do. And I think that by setting this context, by sort of giving you a foundation that feels like a place upon which you can grow rather than starting from nothing. And particularly with the collateral you create, this sets the context for all of the work that's going to be done, or the work that's going to maintain your organization, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the other thing about this is I always think about this. This seems like very intuitive to Roland and I, and I'm sure to a lot of our audience members. But when I'm presenting this back to stakeholders, a lot of them come and see these things as project deliverables. There's like a piece of collateral that's required as a single point in time, an initiative. And setting up a business architecture practice feels like a bit of a stretch. It feels like an ask. And proving that the value of this ask is very high is often a challenge for business architects. So particularly when you take a look at like the value proposition of this discipline as a stood up capability, if you will, of your organization, like you're talking about deliverables. What specific problems are you trying to solve, and problems are you trying to stop from occurring, or risks from occurring in your business?
put it this way. So when we think about enterprise architecture, you hear the common application rationalization, right? Oh,
yes,
we've got
save
three
money.
different. We've got three applications that all effectively do the same thing. Finance has one, customer operations has one, and supply chain has one, right? And then one of the activities, one of the first things that an enterprise architect will say is, well, you're paying for three different applications that all effectively do the same thing. You could rationalize this down to one and save yourself another $250,000 a year, whatever that is, right? Take that in the context of away from application and think about it in a case of capabilities. Well, if in that example of those three different departments, what are they all doing? They might have like an instance of like inquiries, like they're looking for where's my stuff, and finance is like going out to say where's my stuff for X. Customer operations is saying I'm handling customers' requests, and they're always asking me where's my stuff. And the supply chain is also working with suppliers is saying where's my stuff, right? So all three are effectively doing the same thing: inquiry management. We can look at that and reflect as an organization to say, well, if all three of you are all doing the same thing, which one of you would you say does it the best? Who has the lowest, lag time to finding out where your stuff is and actually receiving it? Who's fastest at being able to receive it and then put it into inventory or into use? And then you can look at it and say, well, maybe this is an application thing. Maybe it's just a process thing. Maybe that these other guys just been doing it. It's in their nature, like supply chain. It's in their nature to know where stuff is at any time, anywhere. So they can have a really good set of processes and also a set of skills baked into the personnel who do that work every day. So rather than always leaning on application rationalization, let's look at capability rationalization. Can we figure out how to maybe cross-train and cross-skill our own personnel to say, let's go work with supply chain for the next 6 months and figure out how they do their job in this particular example, and then figure out how to apply that working and that knowledge in finance, in the customer operations, right?
I love it. I love it. And I wanted to just put a pause briefly in here because I know our audience's brains are burning. I know we got so much more to say, and we're gonna come back with a little bit of a specific example of how you leverage business architecture. But in the meantime, I want you to think about your experiences of business architecture. And audience out there, do you have a business architecture practice within your organization? How do you capture information? How do you create collateral deliverables for that information? How do you align that with stakeholder expectations? And how do you avoid those unintended consequences of change in how you do business architecture and how you deliver business in your organization? We'll leave you for a moment and come back with our second section, a specific example of business architecture applied to new product design.
And welcome back. Mike, this is a very interesting conversation. I think that business architecture is a very underrated discipline, if you will. Even I would call it, I don't know how I would call it, process management or architect, whatever. Right? Doesn't matter how I want to call it. But I think the concepts behind, and you mentioned it rightfully so, to bridge the gap between strategy and the implementation is very interesting. And speaking of implementation, I know, and that was the hook why we invited you to this show, was I know that you applied it to a real life scenario of a new product that you were developing or you are developing right now. And we agreed upon that we will speak very abstractly about it so that there's no proprietary information about this, because I think what's interesting is for our audience is to learn how you approach this and what type of deliverables do you create and what's the value behind them and all those things. So can you give us a little whatever 1 minute breakdown and an introduction into what the scenario is that you want to bring to market.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So basically, in the context of a healthcare, you've got patients who are seeing their primary care physicians for a number of reasons, and sometimes they're oncology in nature. And a common application used in the business is a clinical decision support tool. And what we want to try and do is see if there's an opportunity to help primary care physicians, while they're not classically trained in oncology, try to give them a sort of process with decision points and next steps on how to help understand where their patient is in their journey, and then potentially figure out where they should go next. Should they go see a specialist? Should they go have blood work done? Should they go to see an oncologist? And ultimately take the guesswork out of it for them, and then enable a sort of 21st century experience, because everybody's a customer, and have them understand and leverage this technology to help facilitate that next best action for their patient. So that's sort of the elevator pitch for what the product aims to do.
And I can tell you, that this becomes very personal to me, because having gone through the process recently, not everyone in the whole healthcare team has a picture and can answer questions. And in particular, families and caregivers of people going through this process they have lots of questions. They want to try and influence the outcome, obviously, but more importantly, in some ways, they just want to know what the process is going to be. For the most part, that their outcomes cannot really be as meaningfully influenced as they would perhaps like them to be. So they want to just be able to understand what they can expect. And I'm assuming the healthcare providers and work collaboratively with primary care providers like family doctors and with patients and their families to make it a more informed experience of cancer care. And that seems like a good thing for all. But to build that product, I suspect you have to have a lot of the components of that sort of locked down so that you can develop towards it. So tell me about I can see the need. Tell me about the first steps in getting you from, okay, so I understand what needs to be done. Now, what should I start looking to capture in order to understand the requirements of what I'm going to build?
Right. So, all right. So we understand that there's a need. You do have to ask yourselves, because, ultimately most hospitals, if not all, are businesses, right? So they have certain goals and objectives that they themselves are trying to meet. So one of the first things you should do is first make a determination of, is this in alignment with what the organization is trying to do? First. Second, and maybe in parallel to that, it doesn't necessarily have to be sequential, but it's also, is there a market need, right? Is there something out there that people would be willing to use or buy, what have you, right? So product market fit is a key action that any product manager should attempt to take. And then aligning it back to organizational objectives is the second thing, right? Next, getting down into sort of the meat and potatoes of it, with leveraging the Business Architecture Guild's, approach. It's looking at those value streams that I was mentioning earlier, right? So obtaining a treatment plan for a patient is in fact the value stream that we would be focused on at this point in time. That paints the background of the picture. It sets the tone and has a context for where we are working within. In that value stream, we can look at all of the stakeholders who are participating. We look at all the people. We look at all the exit and entrance criteria for each of those stages. And we figure out, well, what's necessary to come in and leave certain aspects of that value stream. We can then look at the capabilities that enable those value stream stages to deliver on the value at the end, right? Each stage produces a small package of value. As it's moving through, that package is getting bigger and better and more refined for the ultimate end state, which in this case is determining what is the next best action or what is the treatment plan for that patient. So once we have understood where we're working within the value stream, whom is participating in that, our stakeholders, the capabilities that enable those stages in the value stream to deliver on whatever pieces of value is necessary, we can then begin to analyze and reflect a little bit on what's already happening in an organization. Just as I was mentioning earlier, are there other aspects of the organization that do these same things? Can we repurpose some of the same processes? Can we repurpose some of the skills and say, oh, that person over there does this job really well, let's learn from them? Does this organizational unit over here have some of the applications that could satisfy the technical requirements needed to develop this solution?
I have a question for you about this, because at what point in time in this conversation do you introduce other auxiliary types of objects or approaches that would be required for you to validate the solution? And I'm particularly thinking about regulatory obligations and patient information itself. So the data analysis that would go into some of the things like determining patient routing on a pathway, and also with the sources of data that would be and what sort of obligations you would have as a result of obtaining said data as part of the system. So where does that factor into the conversation at this sort of like layout stage?
Well, I mean, regulation and regulators are stakeholders, right? So we're bound to them. So we understand where they sit in and how they participate in and out of any given value stream. So they're already at top of mind because they are a key stakeholder in our organization, as well as outside physicians and the patients and the insurance payers as well. We also have auxiliary, internal stakeholders too, that we have to, work with constantly in order to make sure that we are continuously delivering on that piece of value at the end of the value stream. In this case, it's our patient who is our ultimate, recipient of that. The data, we want to make sure whatever is enabling that piece of value to be delivered in that stage of the value stream, well, we can understand what that is because we'll know what pieces of data are required for that piece of value to be realized. We'll say, well, does it live in this application, or is it this particular business unit that's responsible for that? And as I mentioned earlier, you have that SIPOC. You can even further decompose this into incremental steps. So you can take that value stream stage, and then effectively what I would like to try and do is if the value stream stage is at this, it's probably BPMN level 0. And then you further deprecate it or decompose it rather into its more incremental steps. So then you're getting a very specific nuanced view of what that process looks like, who's participating in it, what are the applications and technology that's enabling that process to function. And then we can figure out, well, is this going to change? Or can we enhance this further, optimize it, whatever the case may be.
So you're doing this, and I try to understand the bigger context of it. So are you doing this for each individual solution design, or do you do this in advance before you even start thinking about, or when you start thinking about, is that a project? Is that a program? Is that a bigger thing? How long will I need for this? Or is it just something that you create as an artifact? And yes, I check the box. I've done this. I've created a process model. I don't care what it is. Move on. How does that all fit into that bigger picture? And what is your recommendation? What is your recommendation for somebody who tries to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, it's a great point. So, we don't want to create processes or create work, just create documentation for documentation's sake, right? So a repository of sort, right, is really essential to this. Now, depending on where the organization may or may not be in their maturity, that's relative, right? If you're super mature, you have some sort of EA repository. And the Business Architecture Guild does not have any specific application that they talk about. They're fairly agnostic, but you can leverage any type of EA enterprise architecture repository, right? Good. So the idea is that so like you guys have said, aptly called your podcast here, right? What is the baseline, right? You want to get a baseline assessment of how your organization works. So you want to go after those core domains like value streams, capabilities, stakeholders, and so on, and document them in your thing, right? In your repository. Always refine them, but in theory, those core domains really won't change very much unless you're fundamentally changing something about the business model, right? In this example of this new product that I'm thinking about, this could actually be a fundamental shift in what a business model might look like for an organization, right? If they were to take this product and make it commercialized, well, now they're getting into a commercialized product market. It's no longer just patient driven, right? Now you're producing products for the market to leverage. Now you have a whole new business model. It could be a new sign of revenue, could be new channels and new partners and so on, right? So unless those things are changing about the organization, the business model, if it's staying relatively the same and static, your value streams and your capabilities will pretty much be the same. Their levels of maturity will change as you pursue making them better, but ultimately they don't change very much. So you have your map, right? You have your blueprint of your organization.
And now let's translate that down, right?
Right.
Into something that will help aid in the design based off, because this feels a little bit like requirements. Like I feel like this is maybe a superset of requirements. Before you get into the specificity of what you're going to have to build, you need to know the ecosystem of context within which you are going to build. Otherwise, the chances are you might build the wrong thing or miss something crucial as you build. So let's talk a little bit about how you take that and it gets distilled kind of like a fine spirit into the projects or into the initiatives that make your new product.
Right. So if in this case, this particular product, and every organization will have their own way of sizing out things and determining if they are a project or a pilot, prototype, program, initiative, epic. There's all sorts of adjectives that describe the size and complexity of a particular change. So I can't necessarily speak to that because it's all relative, right? But however the organization decides to determine the size and complexity of their particular change, the idea is to then, sort of like you would any other software development lifecycle or any change project, you assess the impacts of it. You look at what you can use today, hence the rationalization outside of the technology, but other aspects of an organization, harmonizing that work, synergizing with other people in the organization, and then coalescing around this project to say, this is the value stream. This is the scope of work. These are the capabilities that we're targeting because we understand them by definition and experience that they will enable us to do this work. And then we can assess whether or not we want to repurpose this technology. We want to build something on our own. We want to buy something net new.
And I think there's another aspect, and I don't remember that you said it explicitly, so I want to put some words in your mouth. I think following that approach also has another benefit because it gives focus, right? It gives an alignment between all those individual pieces that somehow need to come back into some form of configuration. What were your experiences when you're working on that product in that regard?
Well, trying to get the alignment is always the most hard part because either people don't understand it or they feel it's not a priority or they feel like it may be conflicting with their own work and now you're battling for budget. So what I like to try and do is to say, well, if our North Star, at least together, is this particular strategic objective, can we distill that down into your scope of work or my scope of work? Can I repurpose what you've already built? Can you repurpose what I've already built? Can we tag team this particular work and maybe share the budget, or I give it to you, ultimately, or you give it to me, whatever the case is. We're working for the benefit of the organization. That can't be overstated. Like challenging each other and fighting for resources is an ongoing thing. But if we're doing it in effort to move the organization forward, well, then ultimately we should all win, right? So in that way, let's try not to recreate any wheels, so to speak, but maybe evolve them and improve them.
Which I wholeheartedly agree. And unfortunately, we're getting to the top of our self-allocated recording time. But I do have one more question for you, Mike. And this is about architectures. To me, is building structures. All right. So there is, and that is, I don't know, an inherent problem with having project work. Because what is the typical thing that people do? Oh, we're going to do a project and hooray, we're done. We're moving on to the next more interesting stuff, the new shiny toy. But then you need to capture this and you need to keep it alive or evergreen to be those catalogs that you mentioned before. How does my organization look like? Or what app landscape do I have? Or how did we implement this solution in some form or fashion? What were your experiences in how people solve that problem? So not just delivering a single project and then move on, but creating something that is more sustainable, if you will?
I think it's a goal of any enterprise architecture group, right? And I would say this is, in my view, one of the key value propositions of an enterprise architecture group. And I'm saying that as the collective we, like business architecture is part of that, right? They help the organization through an experience of self-service, right? So they go into this repository, and as these architectures, these products, or these process improvements, or these business model changes are occurring, things are being documented and being reflected as a result, so that the next person can go in and say, who else, or if they can run some sort of query to say asset management or inquiry management, they should be able to see a whole mess is a bad word, but a whole connective tissue of work attached to that inquiry management capability. And to say, these are the sorts of initiatives that did this work previously. These are the stakeholders who currently have a stake, an ownership stake in this inquiry management. Supply chain is a big stakeholder in this, right? These are metrics that are tied to this. So I know that if I change this particular inquiry management capability for the better, I know that I should be affecting XYZ metric for the organization. So it's trying to create sort of an ontology, so to speak, of like how all these things are connected to each other and leveraged in and out the organization, so that we don't have to recreate the wheel every time. We're simply trying to improve it going forward.
I love it. I love it. And I think with all these questions, we've come to the top of the hour for us. And we're gonna leave the audience with just one more question here, which is to think about how you've done product development. I'm sure everyone's worked in organizations where they're introducing new capabilities within the organization and new go-to-market offerings for their customers, for their partners, for whomever they serve. What sort of architectural work did you do or did you not do to help make that process go a little bit easier, to make sure you captured the stakeholders, make sure you captured your existing capabilities or applications, make sure you reused what you could, and make sure you aligned it with the strategic goals of what the organization is trying to do? Did you or did you not? We'll leave you for a moment to think about that and come back with our final thoughts and conclusions for the episode.
You can't count upon the walls to stay standing. The wind will blow across your path. Across your path. The wind will blow, but it's just changing. It's just changing. The wind will blow, but it's just changing. It's just changing.
And welcome back. Hey, that was a really interesting conversation, and it was refreshing to see an approach that actually tries to bridge the gap between strategy and technology. Because as I said a couple of minutes ago, feels like hours, for most of the hardcore EA folks, business is something that we do not understand. So I really see a need for filling that gap and getting the connection between what should be done, what's valuable for our customer, and how it is implemented. But I'm pretty sure I'm not the only guy who has those warm and fuzzy feelings after this conversation and has the interest to talk more about this topic. So Mike, I know your email address. I know where you live. But how can people get into contact with you?
I would say the best place is on LinkedIn. Big LinkedIn person. Feel free to reach out to me, message me directly. I connect with pretty much anybody. I want to talk about this topic until forever. I think it's super interesting. It's sort of little serendipitous in how I got to here. So it's really near and dear to my heart.
And it is also a little serendipitous on how all of you got here, audience. Thank you so much for coming along with us. Thank you so much, Mike. This was a great conversation. We love hearing from folks who like to listen to What's Your Baseline. So feel free to reach out to us at hello@whatsyourbaseline.com or go to whatsyourbaseline.com for a lot more information. In fact, whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 75 for lots of great stuff about this particular show and more from Mike DeCamp. Well, it's been such fun, friends. We will see you soon. And until then, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
Mike DeCamp.
And my name is Roland Voigt.
And we will see you in the next one.